A mother accidentally discovered bruises on her daughter's body, so she decided to install a camera, and the horrifying truth that unfolded left her devastated. The sun filtered softly through the trees, casting dappled shadows across the garden. Amapola stood by the doorway, watching as Matias guided Anita's small hands to grip the wooden handle of a kite. "Like this," he murmured, his voice steady as ever. Anita, her face alight with determination, nodded and took off, her laughter floating through the air like the kite that slowly rose above her. The wind tugged at the string, and the kite soared higher, its bright red tail fluttering against the pale blue sky. "Look, Mama!" Anita's voice was full of pride, her small body bouncing with excitement. Amapola smiled, the sight of her husband and daughter filling her with a quiet, contented joy that she rarely voiced. Matias straightened, his hands falling to his sides as he watched the kite dip and weave. Amapola's gaze softened. There was something so natural, so peaceful about this scene. The world felt right, as if it had always been meant for the three of them. As Anita ran across the grass, Matias moved slower than usual, his shoulders slumping slightly. Amapola's smile faded just a little. She noticed it, the brief moment when he paused to catch his breath. It wasn't much, not enough to draw attention, but enough for her to see. She said nothing, though her eyes lingered on him, her brow creasing ever so slightly. Anita, oblivious to the growing shadow between her parents, tugged at Matias's sleeve. "Can we do it again, Papa? One more time?" Her voice was full of that boundless energy only a child could possess, and Matias chuckled, though the sound came out softer than usual. "Of course, mi amor," he said, bending down to retrieve the kite. Amapola watched, her fingers gently grazing the fabric of her dress. She thought of saying something, of asking if he was feeling all right, but the words felt heavy on her tongue. She wanted to believe it was nothing, just a moment of tiredness, easily shaken off. But the way he stood, the slight tremor in his hand as he passed the kite string back to Anita, planted a seed of unease in her chest. That evening, after Anita had fallen asleep, Amapola found herself standing by the window, staring out at the garden now shrouded in darkness. Matias sat at the kitchen table, his eyes closed, his fingers pressed against his temples as if easing a headache. "Long day?" she asked, her voice soft, careful not to disturb the quiet. Matias didn't answer right away. After a beat he nodded. "Just tired, that's all," he said, his voice low, almost dismissive. Amapola bit her lip, feeling the weight of the silence between them. It wasn't like him to avoid her gaze. The house, once filled with the light and warmth of the afternoon sun, now felt heavier, the walls closer. She could feel the shift in the air, the unspoken concern settling between them like an invisible fog. The days stretched on, and the changes in Matias became harder to ignore. He moved slower, tired, faster. The lively conversations they once shared over dinner grew quieter, his answers shorter, his laughter rarer. Amapola's eyes followed him constantly, her worry growing beneath the surface. Yet, she said nothing, choosing instead to hold on to the normalcy of their routine, the hope that this was temporary. One afternoon, as they sat under the shade of the tree in their yard, Matias leaned back in his chair, his breath shallow. Anita played nearby, her giggles ringing out as she chased the kite she'd tied to a stick. Amapola reached out, her hand brushing his arm. He opened his eyes slowly, as if waking from a dream. "You've been working too hard," she said gently, her voice more a suggestion than a question. He smiled, though it didn't reach his eyes. "Maybe. I just need some rest." The words hung between them, but neither pressed further. There was a mutual understanding, an unspoken agreement to not yet address the growing concern. As the light dimmed and Anita was called in for dinner, Amapola lingered outside for a moment longer. The garden, once a sanctuary of joy and laughter, now felt different, quieter, as if waiting for something inevitable. Her heart clenched, but she pushed the thoughts away, focusing on the sounds of Anita's laughter from inside. But deep down, she knew something was changing. And though no one spoke of it, the weight of that realization was growing heavier with each passing day. The air in the house was different now, thicker somehow, weighed down by a tension that neither Amapola nor Matias spoke of. It crept into their lives silently, making its presence known through the quiet moments. A sigh too heavy, a glance that lingered a second too long. Matias no longer rose with the same energy. The mornings, once filled with the sound of his boots scraping against the floor as he readied himself for the day, were now marked by long silences and the slow creak of his body easing out of bed. Amapola noticed everything, though she said nothing. Her eyes followed him as he moved around the kitchen slower than before. He didn't meet her gaze as he stirred his coffee, and she didn't push him to. Anita, ever the source of light in their home, still ran to Matias, her face bright with excitement, asking him to come outside and play. She didn't understand why, more often than not, he would shake his head with a soft, apologetic smile. "Later, dear," he would say, his voice soft. "Papa just needs a little rest." The first time, Anita didn't question it. She simply shrugged and skipped outside to play on her own. But as the days passed, the same words from Matias became routine. Later turned into not now. And soon, Anita's visits to her father's side were filled with puzzled stares. Amapola worked tirelessly. She moved through the house with a quiet determination, her hands always busy, tending to Matias, keeping the house clean, making sure Anita was fed and ready for school. But the tiredness in her eyes, the way her hands would sometimes pause in the middle of a task, as if to steady herself, spoke volumes. She never let it show in front of Matias or Anita. To them, she remained steadfast, strong. But in the rare moments when she was alone, her fingers would grip the edges of the sink or table just a little too tightly. The silence in the home was growing. Matias, once the heart of their lively conversations, spoke less and less. His voice, when it came, was quiet, the words carrying a weight that Amapola could feel but not fully understand. She found herself filling the gaps, trying to maintain some sense of normalcy by asking him about his day, his thoughts, anything that would keep the conversation alive. But the answers were short, his sentences trailing off into the void between them. Anita, though still full of youthful energy, began to notice the change. Her laughter was less frequent, her usual exuberance tempered by a quiet confusion. She would come to her father's side, toy in hand, and say, "Papa, come play with me." But when Matias looked up, his eyes dull with exhaustion, she would slowly withdraw, the toy hanging limply at her side. She didn't cry or ask questions, but the small frown that creased her brow as she walked away didn't go unnoticed by Amapola. It wasn't long before Matias stopped getting out of bed altogether. The mornings, once marked by the sound of life beginning, were now hushed. Amapola would wake first, moving quietly through the house, making breakfast for Anita, preparing soup for Matias, her movements mechanical. She would check on him, his body still under the heavy blankets, his breathing shallow. She never asked him if he was all right. She already knew the answer. As the days passed, the house became quieter still. The sound of the wind outside, the occasional chirping of a bird, and the soft shuffling of Amapola's feet were the only things that broke the silence. Even Anita, sensing the shift, played more quietly. her laughter almost non-existent now. Then, one morning, it happened. Matias's breathing had slowed during the night, each inhale and exhale quieter than the last. Amapola knew deep down that the end was near, but she wasn't prepared for the stillness that greeted her that morning. She stood by the bed, her hand resting lightly on his chest, feeling nothing. The preparations for the funeral were quiet, methodical. Amapola didn't weep in front of Anita, though her eyes were red, her movements slower than usual. There was a calm to her, a focus that came with necessity. She had a daughter to care for, a home to keep. The grief would have to wait. The funeral itself was simple, attended by a few close friends. Amapola stood by the grave, her hand resting on Anita's shoulder, the wind pulling at the black veil she wore. As the last handful of earth was thrown over the coffin, Amapola didn't move. She stood there, her gaze fixed on the ground, alone, even in the presence of others. Anita tugged gently at her hand. "Mama, can we go home now?" Amapola nodded, but her eyes didn't leave the grave for several moments longer. Only when she was ready did she turn, her face blank, her steps steady as she led Anita away from the quiet resting place where Matias now lay. The city felt different, a world away from the quiet town Amapola had left behind. Here the streets were crowded with strangers, their faces hurried, their footsteps quick. Cars honked impatiently, and the noise seemed to press in from all sides, unrelenting. Amapola stood on the corner, Anita's hand firmly in hers, waiting for the light to change. Her daughter's small fingers tightened around her own, and Amapola could feel the unease radiating from her. "It's different here," Anita said softly, her eyes wide as she looked at the towering buildings around them. Amapola nodded, her throat tightening. "It is," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. She wasn't used to the noise either. Their old home, with its open fields and familiar faces, seemed like a distant memory now. She had made the decision to move for the both of them, to start over, to escape the painful reminders of Matias. But the weight of the new city, with its constant motion and unfamiliarity, pressed on her shoulders. Their apartment was small, much smaller than their previous home. It was cramped, the walls close together, and the windows overlooked a busy street that never seemed to sleep. Amapola glanced around the sparsely furnished room, still unpacking boxes stacked in the corner. Anita's drawings, which had once adorned the walls of their old house, were tucked away for now, waiting for the right moment to be hung up again. "This is our home now," Amapola said, more to herself than to Anita. Her daughter was already sitting cross-legged on the floor, her doll in her lap, eyes scanning the unfamiliar space. Amapola worked long hours at her new job. It was a necessary sacrifice she had to provide for Anita, and this city wasn't cheap. Her day started early, sometimes before dawn, making sure Anita was ready for school, her uniform pressed, her lunch packed. Then she would rush to work, leaving Anita in the care of the school. But the worry gnawed at her constantly. Was Anita adjusting? Did she feel as lost here as Amapola did? The nights were the hardest. After dinner, after Anita was safely tucked into bed, the apartment fell silent. Amapola would sit by the small kitchen table, staring at Matias's photograph, her fingers lightly tracing the frame. She would gaze out of the window, watching the flickering streetlights below, the blurred figures of pedestrians moving through the dimly lit streets. Sometimes she wondered if she had made the right decision. The city felt cold, impersonal. She had no friends here, no one to turn to in her moments of weakness. But there were small signs of change, of life slowly moving forward. Anita had started making friends at her new school, something Amapola noticed with a mixture of relief and pride. The first day, Anita came home with a drawing of her and a new classmate. Amapola felt a tiny crack in the wall of grief she had built around herself. "Her name is Sophia," Anita had said, holding up the picture proudly. "She likes the same cartoons as me." Amapola smiled, the first real smile in what felt like months. "That's wonderful, mi amor," she said, running her hand gently over Anita's hair. For a moment, the apartment didn't feel quite so small. Work was another challenge, but slowly she began to find her footing. It wasn't easy, nothing about this new life was, but there were brief moments when she felt like she was beginning to settle. She'd met a colleague named Clara, a kind woman who always offered a sympathetic smile when Amapola looked particularly tired. They hadn't spoken much, but there was potential for friendship there, a flicker of warmth in the otherwise cold city. Still, Amapola's nights remained long. After Anita had gone to bed, she would sit by the window, Matias's photograph still in hand, and wonder how she had ended up here, alone, in a strange place, trying to rebuild a life she wasn't sure she had the strength to maintain. Sometimes she would close her eyes and remember their old life, the mornings when Matias would chase Anita through the garden, her laughter filling the air. But those memories felt distant now, like a dream she could no longer grasp. Yet, slowly, life was beginning to settle into a new rhythm. Anita's small victories, making a new friend, adjusting to her school, became Amapola's victories too. Each step forward, however small, was a reminder that they were still moving, still living. And in the quiet moments, when Amapola sat by the window, watching the world outside, she began to feel that maybe, just maybe, they could make this new city their home after all. The pain of Matias's loss hadn't disappeared. It never would. But Amapola had learned to carry it differently now. Amapola first noticed Danilo when he offered to carry a stack of papers for her. It was nothing grand, just a small gesture, but it broke the monotony of her daily routine. "You look like you could use a hand," he said with an easy smile, one that softened the edges of his otherwise tired face. She didn't refuse. The weight of the papers was a small burden compared to the weight she carried inside, but even so she found herself relieved. They worked in the same office, though they hadn't spoken much before. Their interactions had always been polite but distant. Yet, from that day forward, Danilo made it a habit to stop by her desk, offering small bits of advice about the job, or sometimes just asking how her day was going. It wasn't intrusive. He never pushed, never pried. His kindness was subtle, measured in moments that passed quickly and without much fanfare, but Amapola noticed. Days turned into weeks, and their conversations grew less about work and more about life. "My daughter, Anita," Amapola would mention in passing, and Danilo would listen, nodding in understanding. He never interrupted, just let her speak. It wasn't long before Amapola found herself laughing, soft, quiet laughter, the kind she hadn't heard from herself in a long time. It was one of Danilo's jokes, something light and easy, but it broke through the wall she'd built around herself. For the first time since the move, she felt the tension in her shoulders loosen, if only a little. Anita met Danilo a few weeks later. Amapola had mentioned him a few times in casual conversation when Anita asked how work was going. "He's nice," she said simply. "Helps me out sometimes." So, when Danilo stopped by one evening after work, carrying a small bag with a toy rabbit inside, something simple but thoughtful, Anita's curiosity was piqued. She eyed him cautiously, standing a few feet behind her mother, unsure of this new presence. Danilo smiled, crouching down to her level. "I heard you like rabbits," he said, holding out the toy. Anita hesitated, her eyes flicking between her mother and the man in front of her. But Amapola nodded, and after a long moment, Anita took the toy from his hand, her small fingers brushing against his. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible, but the smile that followed was enough. From that moment, Anita's shyness began to melt away. Danilo didn't rush his involvement in their lives. He was patient, allowing space for Anita to adjust to his presence. At first, he would ask her about her day, simple questions that didn't require much more than a nod or a one-word answer. Slowly, though, Anita began to respond with more, offering up bits of her day, the things that had made her laugh or the new friend she'd made at school. Danilo listened, always listening. The dinners were quiet at first, the three of them seated around the small kitchen table. Amapola would prepare the meals, her hands moving automatically as she stirred a pot or set the table, her mind still weighed down by the grief she carried. But Danilo's presence brought a new energy to their home. He would offer to help, and soon their dinners became a shared effort. Danilo chopping vegetables, Anita setting the plates, and Amapola, for once, allowing herself to sit back and watch. It was subtle, the way things changed. The apartment, once filled with silence, now echoed with small moments of laughter, shared stories, and the occasional clatter of dishes being passed around. Danilo moved in after a few months, not all at once, but gradually, his belongings slowly finding a place alongside theirs. It felt natural, the three of them moving together in this new rhythm, building something quietly, carefully. For the first time in a long time, Amapola began to feel something she hadn't allowed herself to feel: hope. Anita's footsteps quickened as she neared the alleyway just blocks from their apartment. She had spotted him earlier, a scruffy, thin dog with matted fur and a forlorn expression. He was huddled against the wall, his ribs visible under his dirty coat. The sight had struck something deep within her, and she couldn't get the image out of her head the entire walk home. As she approached, the dog's ears perked up, but he didn't move. Anita knelt down, her small hand reaching out cautiously. "It's okay," she whispered. The dog eyed her warily, his body stiff, but after a few moments, his tail gave a slow, tentative wag. She looked over her shoulder at her mother, who was standing a few steps behind her. "Can we take him home, Mama?" Anita's eyes were wide, pleading. There was a quiet desperation in her voice, the kind that only children could muster when they truly wanted something. "He's all alone." Amapola hesitated, glancing down at the dog and then back at Anita. "We don't even know if he belongs to someone," she said softly, though she could already feel her resolve weakening. Anita shook her head, standing up to face her mother. "Look at him, Mama. He's not wearing a collar. No one's taking care of him. Please, can we keep him?" Before Amapola could respond, Danilo stepped forward. His face was tight, his tone firm. "Anita, we can't just bring home every animal we find on the street. Dogs are a big responsibility." He crossed his arms, clearly not convinced. "We don't know where it's been, or if it's sick." Anita's gaze dropped to the ground, her fingers fidgeting with the hem of her shirt. "I'll take care of him," she promised quietly. "I'll feed him, and I'll walk him every day. He won't be any trouble." Danilo sighed, rubbing his temples as if the conversation was exhausting him. Amapola could see the tension in his stance, the way his jaw clenched slightly. But then he glanced at Anita, her shoulders hunched and eyes still pleading. His expression softened, just barely. "All right," he said finally, though his voice lacked enthusiasm. "But the first time he causes any problems, we take him to the shelter. Understood?" Anita's face lit up instantly. "Thank you," she exclaimed, throwing her arms around his waist before rushing back to the dog. "Come on, boy," she cooed, her voice full of excitement. "You're coming home with us." The dog, as if sensing he'd been accepted, rose slowly to his feet and followed her. He was cautious, his movements slow, but there was a quiet trust in the way he stayed close to her side. Over the following days, Tommy, as Anita decided to name him, quickly integrated into their lives. At first, Danilo kept his distance, watching with skepticism as Anita bathed the dog in the small bathroom, water splashing everywhere, and scrubbed away the dirt from his fur. But Tommy was patient, standing still as Anita worked, his large brown eyes following her every move. Within a week, the bond between them had become undeniable. Every morning, Anita would wake up early to take Tommy for a walk before school, his tail wagging eagerly as he trotted beside her. In the afternoons they played in the small park near their apartment, Anita's laughter echoing as Tommy chased after a stick she threw for him. Amapola noticed the change in her daughter, the way her eyes sparkled when she talked about Tommy, the energy she had when she bounded through the door after school. It was a joy that had been missing since Matias had passed, a lightness that Amapola hadn't seen in her for months. And though she never said it out loud, Amapola was grateful. Even Danilo, despite his initial reluctance, couldn't help but soften toward Tommy. He watched, arms crossed, as the dog followed Anita around the house, never straying far from her side. Tommy was protective, alert, always keeping an eye on her as if he understood her importance. One evening, as they sat at the dinner table, Danilo glanced at Tommy, who was curled up at Anita's feet. "He's not so bad," he admitted, almost begrudgingly. "As long as you keep taking care of him, like you promised." Anita nodded vigorously, her smile wide. "I will," she said with certainty. "He's my best friend." And from that day on, Tommy became more than just a stray dog. He became part of their family, quietly filling the spaces left by grief and uncertainty, bringing with him a sense of comfort and companionship that none of them had realized they needed. It started slowly, the changes in Anita so subtle that Amapola almost didn't notice at first. The mornings, once filled with laughter as Anita raced to take Tommy on his walk, grew quiet. She still walked him, but the enthusiasm had faded. Her steps were slower, her eyes distant, as if she was going through the motions of something that no longer brought her joy. Amapola watched, her concern growing silently in the back of her mind. Anita wasn't the same. At dinner she barely touched her food, her head often bowed, eyes fixed on her plate. When Danilo asked about her day, she gave short answers, her voice barely above a whisper. The lively girl who once chattered endlessly about her school friends and games with Tommy had become quiet, withdrawn. "Anita, is everything okay?" Amapola asked one evening, her voice soft, not wanting to alarm her daughter. Anita nodded, not meeting her mother's eyes. "I'm fine, Mama, just tired." Amapola didn't press her further, though her instincts told her something was wrong. She noticed more as the days passed, Anita flinching when Tommy brushed against her, recoiling from his usual playful nudges. The dog seemed confused, his large eyes following her, waiting for the affection she once freely gave. But Anita avoided him, choosing instead to sit in silence, her fingers nervously twisting the hem of her dress. One evening, as Amapola helped Anita change into her pajamas, she saw them, bruises, dark and spreading along her arms and legs. Her heart skipped, her breath catching in her throat. "Anita," she said, her voice tight with concern, "how did you get these?" Anita froze, her eyes wide. She shook her head, pulling her sleeves down quickly. "I don't know. Maybe I fell." Amapola wanted to believe it was just a childhood accident, something simple like tripping at school or bumping into something in the park. But the bruises didn't fade, And more appeared, each time in different places, each time deeper in color. She kept her worry to herself, unsure of how to approach the topic. She watched Anita closely, hoping, praying. It was nothing more than an accident. Danilo, however, wasn't so patient. He noticed the bruises too, his frustration bubbling to the surface. "It's the dog," he said one evening, his voice sharp. "That dog's too rough with her. He's always been too big for her to handle." "Tommy wouldn't hurt her," Amapola replied, though her words lacked the conviction she usually held. She glanced at Anita, who sat quietly at the table, her hands folded in her lap, eyes staring blankly at the floor. "You're too soft on that animal," Danilo continued, his voice rising. "I've seen how he jumps around her, how he pushes her. It's dangerous." Anita remained silent, her face pale. The room felt heavy with tension, the space between them thick with unspoken fear. Amapola looked at her daughter, wanting desperately to ask if Danilo was right, if Tommy had somehow caused those bruises. But Anita's silence spoke louder than words. Days later, the decision was made. Danilo insisted, and Amapola, torn between her husband's logic and her own doubts, reluctantly agreed. Tommy had to go. Anita's reaction was immediate. She clung to Tommy, her small hands gripping his fur as if letting go would mean losing something far greater than just a pet. "Please, don't take him," she whispered, her voice trembling. Tears streamed down her face, silent and steady, as she buried her head in Tommy's neck. The dog stood still, as if sensing the gravity of the moment, his large eyes filled with confusion and sadness. Danilo's expression was set, his frustration now an unshakable resolve. "It's for your own good," he said, though his tone lacked the softness a father's words should carry. "He's hurting you, Anita. You'll see." Amapola watched, her heart breaking as Anita's quiet pleas filled the room. She'd never seen her daughter like this, so desperate, so afraid. But in the end, Tommy was led out, his paws dragging slightly as if he too understood that he wouldn't be coming back. Anita didn't say a word after that. She stood by the window, watching until Tommy disappeared from sight. Then, without a sound, she turned and went to her room, closing the door gently behind her. Amapola sat down, her hands trembling. The house felt colder, emptier without Tommy's presence. But deeper still, she felt something shift, something dark and unsettling, lurking just beneath the surface of her daughter's silence. For a time, the house returned to its usual rhythm. Without Tommy, Anita seemed to fall back into the patterns of her old self. Her laughter, though quieter, echoed in the small apartment again. She spent her afternoons drawing or sitting with Amapola, occasionally asking about Tommy, but never with the same desperation as before. Amapola allowed herself to relax, if only slightly. Danilo seemed satisfied with the change, convinced that removing the dog had solved the problem. Weeks passed, and the bruises faded, as if they were part of a bad memory slipping away. Amapola watched Anita closely, but the child seemed all right. More than all right, even. She smiled more, spoke more, and didn't shy away when Danilo entered the room. For the first time in months, Amapola thought maybe they had finally left the darkness behind. Then, one evening, as Amapola helped Anita get ready for bed, she saw it again. A faint, fresh bruise on her arm, purpling just below the surface. Her heart tightened, but she said nothing. Not yet. It could have been anything. A bump at school, maybe. Children bruised easily, she told herself, though her stomach twisted. The next morning, another appeared, darker and more defined on Anita's leg. The familiar dread crept in, cold and unrelenting. Amapola didn't ask this time. She simply helped Anita dress and sent her off to school as usual. But her mind was racing. That night, after Danilo had fallen asleep, Amapola sat at the kitchen table, her hands trembling. There was no dog to blame now, no easy explanation. The bruises had returned, just as before, and Anita said nothing. The silence felt heavier, more dangerous. Amapola's breath was shallow as she considered the possibilities, her thoughts darting between denial and fear. Finally, she made a decision. She couldn't rely on questions that went unanswered, nor could she confront what she didn't fully understand. The next day, Amapola quietly bought a small camera, one that could be easily hidden in Anita's room. She installed it discreetly, tucked behind a stack of books on the shelf. She told no one, not Danilo, not Anita. She needed to see for herself. For 2 nights, nothing happened. Anita slept soundly, undisturbed, and Amapola began to doubt herself, wondering if she had overreacted. But the next night, Amapola's breath came in shallow, ragged bursts as she sat watching the grainy footage from the camera. Her hands trembled, still clutching the phone, but she couldn't move. On the screen, Danilo stepped closer to Anita's bed. The faint glow of the nightlight illuminated his face. The familiar features twisted into something sinister. Amapola's stomach churned as she watched in horror. She couldn't process it. This man she had trusted, allowed into their lives, was quietly preying on her daughter. She felt paralyzed, the weight of realization crushing her as she watched him reach out to pull back the blanket covering Anita. The little girl didn't stir, completely unaware of the danger looming over her. Suddenly, a sound, a faint scratching, broke through the silence. Amapola blinked, refocusing on the screen just as Tommy, the dog they had sent away, leapt through the half-open window. His large frame crashed into the room, moving with a force Amapola had never seen before. Danilo turned in shock, his hand jerking back from Anita as Tommy growled low, the sound reverberating through the small room. Without hesitation, Tommy lunged. His teeth bared, and in that instant, all of the tension in the room snapped. Danilo staggered back, his eyes wide with panic. Tommy didn't let up, positioning himself between Danilo and Anita, his growl deepening, warning Danilo to stay back. Amapola's heart raced as she realized what was happening. Tommy had returned to protect Anita, to do what Amapola couldn't at that moment. Shaking herself from her paralysis, she grabbed her phone, her fingers fumbling over the numbers as she dialed the police. Her voice was shaky, but she forced herself to stay calm. "There's an intruder," she whispered, trying to control the tremor in her voice. "He's in my daughter's room. Please, send help immediately." Her eyes darted back to the screen. Tommy stood firm, his presence unwavering. As Danilo backed away, his face contorted in anger and fear. He glanced at the window, but Tommy snapped at him, blocking any path of escape. Within minutes, the distant wail of sirens filled the night. Danilo's gaze darted toward the door, and Amapola could see the panic setting in. The game was over. Amapola hurried to Anita's room, her hands shaking as she turned the doorknob slowly. Tommy remained at attention, his growls low and steady, while Anita stirred lightly in her sleep, still blissfully unaware of the chaos around her. "Tommy?" Amapola whispered, her voice thick with emotion, and the dog turned toward her, his eyes softening. Relief washed over her as she crouched down, wrapping her arms around him. When the police arrived, Danilo had no time to react. He was taken away, his protests drowned out by the loud commands of the officers. Amapola clutched Anita close, pressing her lips to her daughter's forehead, whispering soft reassurances. She looked at Tommy, her loyal protector, standing guard, and for the first time in a long while, she felt a sense of safety return. Tommy had saved them both. Amapola stood outside the courthouse, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. The cool morning air did nothing to calm the storm inside her. The last few weeks had been a blur, police reports, statements, and endless questions. And now, today, Danilo would face justice. She still couldn't wrap her mind around it, the horror of what she had uncovered. Amapola turned to her daughter, who stood beside her, Tommy by her side, his head resting gently against her leg. She knelt down, resting a hand on Tommy's neck, drawing strength from the dog's quiet presence. He had been her daughter's protector when she couldn't be, and she would never forget that. "I'm ready," Amapola said, though the words felt heavy. She rose and took Anita's hand. Together they walked inside. The courtroom was cold, sterile. Danilo sat at the defendant's table, his expression flat, but Amapola could see the tension in his posture. She didn't look away, didn't allow herself the comfort of turning her head. He had taken too much from them. He wouldn't take her strength as well. The trial was short. The evidence was overwhelming. The footage, the bruises, Anita's quiet testimony. Danilo's lawyer tried to paint a picture of confusion, of misjudgment, but it was useless. The truth was laid bare for all to see. When the judge finally spoke, his voice echoed through the room. "Mr. Danilo Cortez, you are hereby sentenced to 15 years in prison for child abuse and assault." There was no celebration, no relief, just a quiet acceptance. It was over. As they left the courtroom, Amapola felt the weight of the past months lift slightly, but she knew this was only the beginning. Healing would take time for both her and Anita. They had been through so much, but now, at least, they could move forward. Outside, Tommy wagged his tail, sensing the shift in the air. Anita knelt down, wrapping her arms around him. "We're safe now, boy," she whispered into his fur. Amapola watched them, her heart full of gratitude. Tommy had returned to them just days after Danilo's arrest, as if he knew his work wasn't done yet. He was part of their family now, as much a protector as he was a friend. "Let's go home," Amapola said, her voice steady. She took Anita's hand again, feeling the warmth of her daughter's fingers interlace with hers. Tommy trotted alongside them, his steps in perfect rhythm with their own. The road ahead wouldn't be easy. Amapola knew that. But for the first time in what felt like forever, she believed they would be okay. Together, they could rebuild, with Tommy always watching over them. The mornings began to feel lighter. The weight that had once clung to their home was slowly lifting, like the fog retreating with the first rays of sunlight. It didn't happen all at once. Healing rarely does, but there were signs, subtle shifts in the way Anita moved through her day. The quiet that had settled in her eyes after Danilo's arrest began to fade, replaced by glimmers of the girl Amapola had always known. Anita laughed again. It wasn't the loud, carefree laughter of before, but a softer, more cautious sound. Still, it was there. Amapola would hear it when Anita played with Tommy in the garden, the dog bounding alongside her as they chased after sticks and shadows. It had been months since their lives had been turned upside down, but slowly the pieces were finding their way back together. At night, the nightmares still came, though less often. Amapola would hear Anita stir in her sleep, her voice whispering Danilo's name in fear. But then there was Tommy, always by her side. The dog would nuzzle against Anita, his warmth a comfort that no words could provide. Soon Anita would settle again, her breathing evening out, and the house would fall back into a peaceful stillness. For Amapola, the days were long, but purposeful. Work had become her refuge. She poured herself into her job, finding strength in the structure and routine it provided. The memories of Matias and Danilo, once overwhelming in their intensity, now seemed like distant echoes. They were still there, of course, whispers of the past that would never fully leave her, but they no longer defined her days. Her focus was clear now. Anita. Every morning, as she watched her daughter grow stronger, Amapola felt a quiet sense of pride. They had survived something unspeakable, and yet here they were, moving forward, day by day. One evening, as they sat together at the dinner table, Anita looked up from her plate, her voice small but steady. "Mama, I don't feel scared anymore," she said, her hand resting lightly on Tommy's head. The dog, as if sensing the importance of the moment, looked up at her with his large, trusting eyes. Amapola smiled, her chest tight with emotion. "I'm glad, mi amor," she replied, her voice soft. "We're safe now." It was a simple statement, but it carried the weight of everything they had been through. For the first time in what felt like years, Amapola allowed herself to breathe deeply, to let go of the tension that had gripped her for so long. Together, they had rebuilt their lives, not just as mother and daughter, but as something more. Tommy had become a permanent fixture in their home, his presence a constant reminder of the bond that had grown stronger in the wake of the darkness they had faced. The future no longer felt uncertain. Amapola could see it now, clear and full of possibility. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the room in a soft golden glow, she felt a sense of peace settle over her. They had found their way through the storm, and now, at last, a new dawn awaited them. Thank you for watching today's story. It's a difficult and powerful reminder that sometimes the ones we trust most can be the very ones who cause the most harm. As parents, guardians, and caretakers, it's our duty to protect our children, whether they're boys or girls, no matter what. It's not always easy to see the signs, but paying attention to changes in behavior, mood, or physical health could save a life. No suspicion is too small when it comes to your child's safety. Speak up, stay vigilant, and always prioritize their well-being, because they rely on us to shield them from harm. This story contains serious themes that are not suitable for younger viewers, and it serves as a strong warning. Sometimes the danger comes from within our own circle. Don't turn a blind eye to red flags. Be their voice when they're too afraid to speak. If you found this story moving, or you know someone who needs to hear this message, please share it. Let's raise awareness, protect our children, and make sure their safety always comes first. Stay alert, stay strong, and let's take care of the ones we love. This content is intended for mature audiences due to its sensitive subject matter. Thank you for watching, and don't forget to subscribe for more meaningful stories and conversations.